Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Waking the Shadow, the online course for deep shadow work using tarot. I'm going to get us started here. And starting off with just a brief course overview of the different themes, topics we're going to go through before we get to the tarot method of interpretation. First, we're going to look at shadow and theory of the unconscious. That's the part that's through the psychological lens. We're going to also talk about non-duality, which is looking at the unconscious through that spiritual lens. We're going to talk about the process of waking, which is essentially integration, meaning moving the stuff from the unconscious into the conscious space, moving the unknown into the space of knowing. We're going to talk about seeing the unseen, which is what we refer to when we're doing divination, or what we're doing when we're doing divination. And then we're going to get into the matrix of waking the shadow, that is specifically the method of interpretation. So we'll get more into that later, but it's designed as a matrix. Okay. So the shadow and theories of the unconscious realms. So when we're talking about the unconscious, and specifically the term the unconscious, we have to talk about Sigmund Freud. I always say I teach courses about him sometimes, where he's obviously included. And I always just love to say he's such a fascinating character and person and brilliant. And he brought so much to us in terms of understanding unconscious versus conscious processes. There's a lot that I don't agree with about, and there's a lot that, people talk about, things that are maybe to kind of be taken out of what he really did offer to us, and that's of great value, which is understanding the unconscious. So he talked about something we call the individual unconscious. So this is the holding of information and sensory data, or things that we've experienced, that we have deemed to be in some way unacceptable. We move these things out of awareness to preserve status quo, view of self, to prevent discomfort and anxiety. So when there are things that it's painful to know, we don't know them anymore. We do lots of different things to just get them out of our thoughts. And we do this because if we know things that we don't want to know about ourselves, things that are unpleasant in some way, it makes us anxious. So Freud said, we have this process where we avoid anxiety by deciding to not think about the stuff we don't want to think about. And it's not done on purpose. We don't decide, you know what, that's an idea that I don't like. Never mind, I'm going to think about something else. Sometimes we do that. But this process here specifically is when our unconscious kind of steps in to say, I'm going to take care of you here and move this away from your thoughts, essentially away from your awareness. So here he is, Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. I just think it's a little bit of a funny picture, but I absolutely adore this understanding of unconscious that he brought to us. So I always like to just include a little picture of him. You've probably heard of Freud's structural theory of id, ego, and superego. Maybe you didn't know it was called the structural theory. But basically, if we're looking at this picture here, we can see that we've got id, ego, and superego, and we've got this horizon line. And so the things that we have in awareness are above that horizon line in the conscious space, and the things that we're not aware of are below the horizon in the unconscious space. People usually use this iceberg, you've probably thought about it or heard about it as the iceberg theory, to describe that there's not that much of the stuff that we have going on that we are aware of. There's a great deal of stuff that's in that unknown space that we don't know about, obviously, right? Because it's in the unknown space. So when we talk about id, ego, and superego, very quickly, id is the stuff of drive. It's the aggressive, sexual hunger, all those urges that are deemed kind of animalistic and unpolite. We've got superego, which is all of the things that are communicated to us by society about what's proper, what's not proper, what's acceptable, what we're allowed to do, what kind of behaviors and things will get us to be included and accepted by society versus, kind of dismissed. So we've got these two opposing things, right? The stuff that we want to do that's maybe not so polite and nice, and then this pressure to be social, be acceptable. And ego is that space in between where we determine how we're going to manage that. How are we going to reconcile the demand that's placed on us and that we place on ourselves, right? Because it's not just society. We want to do things the right way versus these urges and drives to just be comfortable, right? The pleasure principle is spoken about here. Ego is an interesting word because when we're talking about it through or in the Freudian space, ego is good. We like ego because it's our thinking mind that is helping us function well in the world. People talk about kind of having an inflated ego. Sometimes through Buddhist speaking or learnings, there's the idea that the ego is a thing you want to kind of move away from. And there's obviously overlap in different ways of looking at that. But here, ego is our friend, essentially, helping us function well and not be anxious and make good choices. Okay. So going back to this process of moving things from awareness to out of awareness to maintain the status quo, to maintain no anxiety as best we can, we move these things out of awareness via a process we call defense mechanism. So Freud called them this because he was presenting this new idea, and he was doing this 1890 into the early, that was the Victorian era, but into the early 1900s, where people didn't really have an idea of the unconscious. He's presenting it, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but the unconscious, this idea about there being this deep well of stuff that we kind of don't know about, is an ancient idea. But Freud's bringing this in this kind of scientific, at that time, right, because we kind of think about it a little bit differently now, but this medical model of scientific understanding of how our minds work. And so he's bringing this into this society, this place where people don't think about it in that way. This is a new idea. So he used something that they did know a lot about, which is war metaphor. And so he referred to it as defense mechanism. I often say to patients and students, let's try to think about these as protective mechanisms rather than things we do to be defensive. Again, this is another one of those words, we talked about it with ego. People don't like the idea of being defensive. What we usually mean by being defensive isn't the best thing, right? It's kind of being not open to seeing our faults. But when we talk about defense mechanism, it's not necessarily a bad thing. They keep us sane, essentially, is I've heard it spoken about in that way, right? Because if we didn't have defense mechanisms, it would be all id floating around all over the place. And that wouldn't be good, right? That wouldn't help us function. It would keep us anxious and upset all the time. So examples of defense mechanisms. Here are some, there's a ton of them, and different theorists have come up with many different ones that we could talk about. But the main ones that you hear a lot about are denial, projection, rationalization, intellectualization, displacement, and reaction formation. That one probably is a little bit more obscure. But denial is basically denying that the thing that we don't want to know about exists. And it's really important to remember that we're talking this as an unconscious process. So we're not saying, oh, that's terrible, I'm consciously aware of it, let me just pretend it doesn't exist and that will be my new story. This happens out of our awareness. So much so that what we experience is that thing doesn't exist. Why would you even question that? It's denial. It doesn't exist. And as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm actually aware, it doesn't. That's not a thing. Projection. Projection is fascinating. It's important, it's useful, but it's also really tricky and really causes a lot of problems, actually, right? So the idea of projection, just like with a projector, is basically that if I have something that's mine, that, again, a little part of me is saying, don't like this, this isn't nice, this isn't pretty, I don't want this makes me anxious to think I have this. I will unconsciously, without thinking about it or specifically deciding to do it, I'm going to project it like a projector onto the blank screen of another person. I'm not grumpy. You are. I'm not the one who's coming in here with a bad mood, changing the tone. You did that because that's not nice. I'm nice. I don't want to be seen as doing that. So I won't see it. I'll just put it onto you. Okay, so that's projection. Rationalization. Rationalization is pretty much what it sounds like. It's when we rationalize something that we've done. And this happens, I didn't talk about it when I was going into that conscious and unconscious, but there's this little space in between called the pre-conscious, where we have some awareness, but it doesn't stay there very long and it gets kind of wiped out. So rationalization is like, oh, there's this uncomfortable thing that I did. I don't like it. Here's a reason. Here's something that explains why I did that. So it's okay that I said that mean thing to her because she's mean to me all the time. And so technically, if you compare them, that's not really mean by comparison. So I'm not mean. I didn't do it. It's not a bad thing. That's rationalization. It's kind of coming up with a story to explain it away. And by the time we've gotten through the story, right, our awareness of the fact that it was something I did that I don't like gets wiped down into the unconscious. That one's a little bit more complicated. Intellectualization is experiencing emotions as uncomfortable and deciding, nope, it's just thoughts. It's not feelings. It's just thoughts. And that also keeps us not so much free from anxiety, though it could be, but doesn't have to be. That keeps us free from just general discomfort. Displacement. This is something that's also very commonly spoken about. If my boss gives me a hard time and I come home and I give my partner a hard time, and then my partner decides to be mean to the dog about it, that's displacement. I'm really angry with my boss, but I don't feel like I have power to express that effectively, so I express it somewhere else. I still get to release it, but I'm doing it in an unfair way, and I'm not aware of it. Again, I'm not aware of it. I'm thinking, and maybe in part there's some projection that gets activated here, I'm upset about being treated like I'm not smart enough. And then I come home and, hey, you partner, you treat me like I'm not smart enough. But they don't. That's coming from somewhere else. So that's displacement. Reaction formation is, again, remember with all of these, they're not happening in a place of awareness. Reaction formation is when I decide that something I don't really like, that I don't have power over, that I can't make go away, I actually like it. It's cold in here and I'm maybe a little too cold, but I like things cold. I prefer this. That way I'm not suffering discomfort. I'm suffering being cold, but I'm not suffering the fact that I don't want to deal with it. Okay, so again, I keep making this point, but it's such an important point. We do these things to avoid discomfort and anxiety. We begin doing this in childhood and adolescence, and we establish mental, emotional habits for how we deal with discomfort, right? So in places where there's patterns of things in our homes, we develop favorites of defense mechanisms that we use to keep us free from this discomfort, and it becomes what we do, right? So if I decide, projection, that worked really well. I like that. I'm going to keep doing that because that makes me never have to be anxious, or much less. So that's how we develop these patterns. But as our circumstances change and we become independent and enter adulthood, our need to do these things reduces, but our habits persist unless we intentionally adjust. So if I'm in a household around certain personalities that make it so that projection works really well, and there could be a ton of different reasons and a ton of different things that we could say about this. But if we just recognize that, in this one particular space, projection works well. People don't call me out for it. People accept it. And therefore I get to kind of do it a lot. I'm not going to change it. But when I'm an adult and I'm around different people that do call me out for it or avoid me because they don't like that I'm doing that, I'm going to have a motivation to change that up a little bit. I'm going to have a motivation to be aware of what I'm doing. And hopefully I'll be in an environment where maybe some of the stuff that's not nice about me that I'm projecting is a little bit more tolerable to other people. And so I can see it as not so bad, and I can adjust and I can change. But it's really important, and this is the process of therapy essentially, right? Is to help us become more aware of the stuff that we do, to see it as not so awful, not so needing of being completely denied and rejected, and then doing something different with it. It's what we're talking about here with Waking the Shadow, really. It's the whole thing. I was pulling up another slide there, sorry about that. This is what we mean when we talk about recognizing patterns. So in therapy, that's what we're doing. We're working to recognize patterns. In the world, that's what we're doing. In Waking the Shadow, that's what we're doing. We're trying to recognize the things that we do that we could change. Okay, so we've talked about we've talked about Freud, and now we're going to talk about Carl Jung. So Freud, we'll remember, had the idea of the individual unconscious, my unconscious, my things that I don't like about myself, I keep them in my little store of unawareness, my unconscious. Jung referred to something that he began to understand as the collective unconscious. So Jung believed that human behavior and experience are guided by our connection to the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious holds the experiences and memories of our ancestors and all humanity.